In this lecture, we are going to explore a feature called attributes. It's uncommon to create a block that doesn't need to store data. You will mostly need to associate data with your blocks for it to be dynamic. In our case, we have a block that will be editable. The user's input should be stored. Otherwise, their input will be lost. Blocks can have attributes, which is data for a block. WordPress makes it incredibly easy to store data in a block. To get started, open the block.json file. The first step for storing data is to provide a list of attributes that should be stored with our block. At the bottom of the file, add an object called attributes. Inside this object, we can add our custom attributes. The name of the property will be the name of the attribute. For this example, we are trying to store the user's input from the rich text component. Let's create an attribute called content. The value for this property will be an object. Inside this object, we can configure the settings for a specific attribute. The minimum requirement for an attribute is its type. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the attributes page from the Block Editor Handbook. An attribute must have a type. The type is a data type for our data. Unlike PHP or JavaScript, WordPress tries to be strict with the type of data that can be stored. This is to reduce the likelihood of an error. WordPress must know the type of data that can be stored in our custom attribute. On this page, there's a section called Type Validation. The following types are supported: null, boolean, object, array, string, integer, and number. Let's think for a moment. We're trying to store the user's input, which is raw text. Which data type would be suitable for this type of data? Our best bet would be the string type. Let's give it a try. Switch back to the block file. Add a property called type with a value of string. After adding our attribute, we can begin using it from within our block's edit component. Open the index.js file. Keep in mind, the edit function is being treated as a component. Like most components, data can be passed down from a parent component. That's exactly what WordPress does. It'll supply functions and properties via props. Inside the edit function's parameters, add the props parameter. Next, let's log this parameter. In the browser, refresh the page with the developer tools opened. If you have to, add the fancy header block. Inside the developer tools, the console panel may be littered with messages. It can be distracting to view these messages during development. To reduce clutter, I recommend clearing the console before debugging an application. After you've cleared the console, the message from our block can be logged by selecting or deselecting the component. Simply clicking on the block will cause React to repaint it on the screen. As you can see, the props parameter has various pieces of information. Most importantly, it has an object called attributes. Strangely, it'll be empty. This is to be expected. We haven't given our attribute an initial value. WordPress will not bother adding our attribute to a block if a value isn't given. That's not a problem. Let's try fixing our block. Switch back to the editor. Inside the index file, let's destructure the props parameter for the attributes property. For readability, we should grab what we need. The other properties in the props object aren't important. We won't need them. So, I think it would be a good idea to destructure the props parameter. Here's the cool part. We can directly destructure the props parameter from the function's argument list. Let's grab the attributes property. Next, let's destructure the attributes object on a new line. This time, we will grab the content attribute. Destructuring is optional. However, it'll be easier to write content as opposed to props.attributes.content. Next, let's try updating the rich text component to use this property. Firstly, The rich text component's input should be set to the value of the content attribute. We should not initialize the component with an empty value unless the block has been added for the first time. On the rich text component, add a property called value. Let's bind it to the content attribute. Afterward, we should update this attribute. The value property does not automatically update the attribute. It'll simply update the rich text component with the latest value. If we were to attempt to use this block, the block would always have the same value. The rich text component has an event called onChange. Let's listen to this event. Like most events, we can set the property to a function. One option is to write the function directly inside the curly brackets. This is a matter of preference. I like to include the function on the same line unless the function is too long. Let's use an arrow function. Inside the argument list, let's add a new parameter called newValue. In the last section, we learned that events will pass down the event object. However, this is not a default event from the browser. It's an event created by the component. The component will pass on the new value of the rich text component. We can use this value to update the attribute. Attributes must be updated with a specific function. From the argument list, let's destructure a function called setAttributes. This function will allow us to update the attributes for a block. Back in the arrow function, let's run the setAttributes function with an object passed in. The setAttributes function has one argument, which is an object of attributes to update. Inside this object, we must specify the attribute to update and its new value. Let's update the content attribute with the new value argument. That's it. We've successfully updated our rich text component to use our attribute. Time to give our block a test. In the browser, refresh the page and add the fancy header block. The block should be fully functional. We can type inside the block to update the current value. But how do we know if WordPress is updating our attribute? That's simple. Let's save our page and refresh. Perfect. The attribute has been saved with our block. We can freely modify the block without a problem. However, our block is not complete. Let's make adjustments in the next lecture.